Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Nath Prana Nathapada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. And Shri Caitanya-caritamrta Shuddha Sindhu Vrindavaniya Surasormi Samum Nimagna Jevai Jaganni Jaganai Swayama Punanti Tan Vaishnavangscha Harinama Parannamami. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tishe Namah. Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Guti Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano. Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Morachita Jeba Nahi Bhuji Keba Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajibe priti janibe rasarariti shuni le borohoihit. Shriyatam shriyatam nityam giyatam giyatam mura chintyatam chintyatam bhaktas chaitanya caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, an exalted songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura Lila, Sri Krishna Das Kaviraja Goswami Pad. Again today we'll absorb ourselves in discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. So we'll resume today in discussion of Payar number 71 in Madhya Lila, chapter 22. We're in the Sanatana Shiksha, we're in the chapter on the Abhidheya, and specifically we're now discussing a gradation among bhaktas, the criterion for which is the relative depth of their rati and prema. So in our last discussion we completed the discussion of the Shraddha Prakaran, where we looked at the three levels of bearers of eligibility for bhakti, and how Shraddha was the principal criterion by which this gradation was established, and how along with that, the relative degree of expertise in Shastra and the reasoning necessary to understand Shastra, as well as a relative degree of purity of heart, or chitta shuddhi, all three of these factors combined computes to the relative level of eligibility or qualification that someone has to engage in sadhana bhakti. So when someone with this adhikar engages in that practice and achieves sadhya bhakti, or the bhakti, the goal of which, or sadhana is that the goal of which is such bhakti, then there is a further gradation in the level of attainment of that sadhya bhakti. In other words, the depth to which that sadhya bhakti becomes manifest within the psyche of a particular bhakta. So this is what we'll look at in the coming verses, which are cited from the Bhagavatam. And in our last class, we just introduced the reason for this criterion. In other words, why does Mahaprabhu and Kaviraja Goswami representing him consider prema to be the primary means of gauging the relative stature of bhaktas? In other words, why is prema the essence of bhakti? Then we left off last time with this passage from Bhakti Sandarbha 187, where it was explained that it's only by virtue of prema that one can truly have sakshatkar, or direct perception of Bhagavan. Prema, we generally know, or priti, to be the prayojana, or the aim of all embodied beings, but, as Jiva Gosvami explains, actually direct perception of the Paratattva, and the most wonderful feature of the Paratattva, Bhagavan, is the actual prayojana, and because that is not actually able to be accomplished without prema, then prema is the prayojan. So prema is actually an intermediate prayojan to what Visvanatha Cakravarti calls Hari Madhurya Darshana, or the perception and experience of Bhagavan's Madhurya. This is the acme of all states of being, if you will. So that's impossible to ever experience without prema for Bhagavan, and it happens to the extent that one has prema for Bhagavan. So Jiva Gosvami, in this passage we read last time, compares a person who doesn't have prema to a person with jaundice. So as a person with jaundice can eat candy but not taste it to be sweet, then similarly, although Bhagavan is the acme of Madhurya, he's not actually experienced to be such without prema, or this capacity to relish, this capacity to taste. So this is Jiva Goswami's reasoning. So we'll unpack that a little further, and then we'll discuss these verses from the Navayogendra Sangvad in the Bhagavatam that demonstrate this gradation in prema. So I'll pick up from there. Last time we read this quote of Jiva Goswami. I've just summarized it, so I won't reread the whole passage again. So just starting from below there. As someone with jaundice does not experience the sweet taste of sugar candy even after eating the candy, so direct perception of Bhagavan without experience of his quality of being dear, or priyatva, that is, experience of him without prema, or at least rati, for him, is akin to having had no experience of him at all. To elucidate the gradation that exists amid bhaktas, rati, and prema, Sri Jivapad cites in the sections, namely 88 to 190 of the Bhakti Sandarbha, that follow the aforecited passage, the very same 3 verses from the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam that are cited next here in Caitanya-caritamrta. In the course of his analysis of these and other verses in the section of Srimad Bhagavatam, where these verses originate, Sri Jivapad presents the view that these 3 verses describe 3 different subcategories of the general category of bhaktas spoken of first, namely advanced or uttam bhagavatas, that is, the highest class of bhaktas who are endowed with a form of sadhya bhakti. In Hari Bhakti Vilas, Sri Sanatana Pad also expresses the same view by citing the same 3 verses from Srimad Bhagavatam as illustrations of the characteristics of 3 levels of bhaktas who are endowed with prema for Sri Bhagavan. He prefaces his citation of these 3 verses in this context as follows, quote, being devoted purely with prema, or the characteristic known as premaika parata, shall be considered to be of 3 types in accord with the threefold gradation in prema. This is as per a division of advanced, intermediate, and beginning. Thus, according to this analysis of Sri Sanatana Pad, the advanced, intermediate, and beginning bhaktas spoken of in the 3 following verses from Srimad Bhagavatam are all to be considered bhaktas endowed with prema, or at least rati. This view is further articulated by Sri Jivapad in Bhakti Sandarbha, when he describes 3 levels of mahantas that have become accomplished, or siddha, in bhakti. So, quote, siddhas in bhakti, those who have achieved sadhya bhakti, are of 3 types. Those who have attained the forms of companions of Bhagavan, what he calls prapta bhagavat parshad deha, those who have been purged of impurities, nirduta kashaya, and those whose impurities are, meaning have been reduced to a state of being inoperative, or murchita kashaya, as in the case of Sri Narada and others, Sri Shukadev and others, and Sri Narada in his past life and others. So Narada in his past life, as it's narrated in the 5th, 6th chapter of the 1st canto, that stage of Narada's journey, he was described as Murchita Koshaya, or where all the impurities within him have been rendered nil, and then he's doing sadhana and therewith achieving prema, or reaching the state, going from the state of rati into prema, and having darshan of Bhagavan, because as we hear in the Madhurya Kadambani, no one actually has genuine darshan of Bhagavan prior to reaching the stage of prema. So Narada, when he's described to once get darshan of Bhagavan, and then Bhagavan saying, "You'll never see me again in this life," this is indicative of his being free from all impurities, having reached the state of prema, and then continuing in his engagement in bhakti, and at the end of that life, attaining a siddha deha and becoming this first category, what is described here as prapta bhagavat parshad deha. And thereafter, he becomes an example of the first category, as Jiva Gosvami mentioned. So, the superiority of the former and the former thereof is to be understood in regard to these three types of siddha bhaktas, who are similar with respect to their possessing prema. In other words, they're listed from greater to lesser. So, Sri Jivapad goes on to explain that the lowest category of siddha bhakta, those whose impurities are inoperative, and in whom there is a fresh sprout of prema, that is the first appearance of rati, are referred to in the third of the following three verses from Srimad Bhagavatam, that is, the verse that describes a beginning Bhagavata. The middle category of siddha bhakta, those who have been purged of impurities and in whom prema has become directly manifest, are referred to in the second of the three following verses, that is, the verse that describes an intermediate Bhagavata. Finally, the first of the following three verses, the verse that describes an advanced Bhagavata, refers to those bhaktas who have been purged of impurities and in whom immense prema has become manifest. So, I'll pause here, make one comment, is that the line of interpretation that's been presented thus far is generally speaking lesser known and may even be perceived as surprising to persons who are acquainted with these three verses in the Bhagavatam that we're about to discuss as being descriptive of a quote, neophyte bhakta who's beginning, an intermediate bhakta, and then a bhakta who's considered advanced or having achieved siddhi. So to say that no, this verse, which is typically used or thought of to refer to a complete beginner, is actually describing someone who already has prema, some persons hearing that may be taken aback, or they may say, we've never heard of this. So undoubtedly, it's a relatively lesser known line of interpretation. So that's why I'm meticulously demonstrating how Jiva Gosvami explicitly gives this interpretation, and not only that, Sanatana Gosvami does as well. However, both Sanatana Gosvami and Jiva Gosvami, as we'll get to right now, also give the other interpretation, which is more commonly known. So it's not that one is necessarily right or wrong, they're both useful in the course of teaching what is Uttama Bhakti and appreciating where all sorts of different sadhakas and siddhas are on the map of that, so to speak. So, I conclude by saying, in Hari Bhakti Vilas and Bhakti Sandarbha, both Sri Sanatan Pad and Sri Jiva Pad also offer alternate interpretations of the following three verses from Srimad Bhagavatam, wherein the verses are construed to describe not three subclasses of Siddha Bhaktas who all have Sadhya Bhakti, but rather three general classes of Bhaktas amongst whom only the advanced or Uttam class is regarded as being endowed with Sadhya Bhakti. Because the payar under discussion, however, speaks of the following verses from Srimad Bhagavatam as evidence specifically for a gradation within bhaktas, rati, and prema, these verses will be explained below, specifically in accord with the that might be redundant, intention for their citation here in Caitanya-caritamrta. So if you ask me, why are you giving this interpretation of this lesser known side of these verses, which pertains to, a more esoteric or a higher standard of things? Why not explain it in a way that's more relevant to beginners or more relevant to practitioners? Then the answer is because if we look at exactly how the Caitanya-caritamrta is articulating this gradation, the Caitanya-caritamrta is talking about a gradation in rati and prema. So the purpose of the citation of these three verses in this context is specifically in accord with this lesser known interpretation of the two verses of Jiva Gosvami and Sanatana Gosvami, not the more common one. So don't worry, in case you're dying to know, I also add the conventional line of interpretation at the end just to be thorough so that no one's disappointed, in case anybody might be. But regardless, the whole methodology that I'm using for this presentation of the text is what you call tatparya vritti, or commenting so as to illuminate the intention of the author. So because Krishna's Kaviraja Goswami says that these verses are cited for the purpose of illustrating a gradation in rati and prema, then we'll look at specifically the way Sanatana Gosvami and Jiva Gosvami have commented on these verses relevant to that particular angle of vision about them. So I hope that's clear as to how we're proceeding and why we're laying it out like this. So now we'll look at these verses of the Bhagavatam, in particular the first one, which describes the Uttam Bhagavata, the top class of all. So moving on, in the first of these verses, an advanced Bhagavata is distinguished by means of description of certain mental characteristics they possess, which are understandable through their various anubhavas, that is, behaviors ensuant from their bhava, that is, their sthayi bhav or sadhya bhakti, that are indicative of the presence of bhava within them. So, Jiva Gosvami in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he specifies in this stack of 11 verses that talk about all the characteristics of a bhakta, what type of characteristic this is. Because sometimes there can be a tendency, when something is defined according to a particular characteristic, to assume that that's the only defining characteristic that something has. But that's not necessarily the case, and specifically here, only 3 of a set of 11 verses are being cited, so it's not that this and this alone is the only thing that makes someone an Uttama Bhakta, or that there's no other characteristic that can indicate that they're of such a status. This is one among a number of them, so he goes into a specification about what type of characteristic that is. So in this case, the quality of the prema of an Uttam Bhakta is being shown by the particular type of anubhav that they're seen to uniquely express. So now we'll dive into this verse, 11.245 in the Bhagavatam. It's a very wonderful verse, and we'll look at quite a number of interpretations. This verse, you could say, has a rich commentarial tradition, and Sanatana Gosvami and Jiva Gosvami have both given multiple interpretations on it, and Sri Chakravarti Pad is no slouch. He also has some further thoughts of his own. So this is a sublime subject matter. So we'll look across the board at a number of different interpretations that have been given of this verse, all of which pertain specifically to this highest strata of Prem Bhaktas. So we'll start with what you might call the most standard or general understanding, and then move into further alternate ways that it can be appreciated. So, Sarva Bhuteshu ya pashyat bhagavat bhavamatmanaha bhutani bhagavatyatman yesha bhagavatottamaha. One who can see the presence of one's own Bhagavan in all entities, and all entities within one's own Bhagavan, is an advanced Bhagavata. So the plain translation here might sound a little bland, or you might render it a little more richly if you were just going to leave it at that. But I've left it in this kind of very plain language so that how the gradation and alternate interpretation comes out is ideally more traceable for those who are only reading in English. So I'll just read it one more time. One who can see the presence of one's own Bhagavan in all entities, and all entities within one's own Bhagavan, is an advanced Bhagavata. The meaning given in the translation of this verse is based on an explanation given by Sri Sanatana Pad in an explanatory verse, that is a karika, he composes to clarify the most commonly understood meaning of the verse. So this verse is so well known and so important that Sanatana Gosvami wrote his own karika just to render the sense of this verse when he discusses the lakshanas of bhaktas and Hari Bhakti Vilas. So he says, quote, one who sees the presence of one's Ishta Devata in all entities and envisions them in him is the meaning of Srimad Bhagavatam 11.245, approved by the Sat. So if we look back at the verse, we have this phrase, Bhagavad Bhavam Atmanaha. So in the translation, I have it here below. I don't need to speak that out. I'll just read ahead and it'll show. So a translation of this verse based on this explanatory verse of Sri Sanatana Pad, which also reflects the initial interpretation of the verse given by Sri Cakravarti Pad in his commentary on this verse, is as follows. So here, because we have so many interpretations, I've given some, not exactly word for word, but more close to that, so that how these various interpretations come out can be traced. So one who can see the presence of one's own Bhagavan, that is, one's Ishtadeva, one's own object of worship, in all entities, and all entities within one's own Bhagavan, is an advanced Bhagavata. So, first of all, you can see that the word bhavam is initially being read to mean simply presence. The word bhav is built from bhu dhatu, the most simple or common meaning of which is to be or to exist. So bhavam in the broadest sense can simply mean presence. So it's in compound with Bhagavan. So Bhagavad Bhavam, Bhagavan's presence. And to take here Atmanaha as a qualifier of that, and to say that this presence of Bhagavan, here it's actually qualifying the way it's interpreted, is that Bhagavan is, quote, one's own. So when we say Bhagavan is my own, then what do we mean? We mean it's the Bhagavan that we hold dear, or the Bhagavan that we aspire to serve, or the Bhagavan that we hold in our heart. So, as per the commentaries, this implication is that it refers to the Ishta Devata. Every bhakta will worship Bhagavan, and other than those who have varieties of Shantirati, they will have a specific form of Bhagavan whom they aspire to serve, who's known as the Ishta Deva, or the desired Deva, or the desired or aspired for form of Bhagavan that they wish to serve, such as the famous art of Hanuman bearing open his chest to reveal his Ishta Devata, Ram and Sita, within his heart. So that's, Hanuman's own Bhagavan, so to speak, is the Ram that cannot be removed from the core of his heart. So in that sense, we get this idea of the Ishta Devata from the word Atmanaha, or Bhagavan being one's own. So one who can see the presence of that Ishta Devata, in other words, that Bhagavan that one cherishes and aspires to within one's own heart, one who can see the presence of that Bhagavan in everyone else's heart, or to be present in every other entity in the animation around oneself, and moreover, to see everyone as existing within that Ishta Devata, or within that Bhagavan of one's own, that person is an advanced Bhagavata. So Chakravarti Pad, he gives examples to illustrate this. Quote, Prahlad verily saw Bhagavan, his own object of worship, in a pillar after being asked by Hiranyakashipu, where is he? And having answered, indeed everywhere. My Prabhu is visible even in this pillar. And similarly, Sri Yashoda saw all entities right in Krishna's belly. So these are instances where Uttam Bhagavatas, or Bhagavan's Parshads, had direct experiences of these two things. So that's, you could say, the simple level, or starting in some sense, how Prem Bhaktas have experience of Bhagavan, and moreover, how under the influence of that Prem, they come to perceive the world, or everything that's present in the world around them as well. So now we'll come to the next interpretation. In Bhakti Sandarbha, Sri Jiva Pad offers an alternate interpretation of this verse, which is based on construing the word Atmani in the second line of the verse to mean in one's own mind, rather than to mean one's own as a modifier of the word Bhagavati, as it was construed in the previous interpretation. Even though, in this alternate interpretation, the word Atmanaha in the first line is still read to mean one's own and refer to Bhagavan. So the word Atma can mean own, or what belongs to oneself, but it can also mean self in the sense of one's mind. So Jiva Gosvami is giving a different interpretation if we, in this case, read the word Atmani to mean in one's mind rather than meaning one's own. So what do we get when we read it that way? We get the following. One who can see, that is experience, one's own manifestation of Bhagavan, the form of Bhagavan desired by oneself, one's Ishtadeva, in all entities, both the conscious and unconscious, and thus all entities within the specific form of Bhagavan that manifests within the self, one's own mind, specifically by virtue of all entities being sheltered in him, is an advanced Bhagavata. So in this context, he's taking it that that in the second line, that all entities are seen within, to be present within the Bhagavan, who's within one's own mind. In other words, that Ishta Devata that one holds in one's heart, one also perceives everyone to be situated in him. And now, is that literally the way, the universe was inside Krishna's belly? Not exactly. Rather, seeing it that everyone is sheltered in Bhagavan. Everyone is dependent upon Bhagavan for their existence, just as particles in the rays of the sun are dependent upon the sun for their existence in the classical way that Jiva Gosvami conceives of the Jiva as a Shakti, and thus an Angsa, and thus a Das of Bhagavan. In that sense, that everyone is existing in a way that is sheltered supported by, sustained by Bhagavan. Perceiving it in that way, they see everyone to be, quote, in Bhagavan, or in the Ishta Devata whom they hold in their heart. In regard to this interpretation, Sri Jiva Pad cites two verses that occur just before the verse under discussion in Srimad Bhagavatam, and depict the attitude and the vision of an advanced Bhagavata, being described in this interpretation of the verse under discussion. So, for context, in the Navayogendra Sangvad, in the course of explaining and teaching what is bhakti, then they state this famous verse, Bhayam Dvitiya Bhiniveshata Syat, that one, who's bound in Maya and suffering and so forth, should engage in one-pointed bhakti to Bhagavan. And then they describe something of how that bhakti is done, and then they describe how someone who's achieved perfection, or an Uttam Bhagavata, acts. And then after that's described, the description is so far out, to put it loosely, that then Maharaj Nimi, he says, who are these Bhagavatas? How do they act like this? Tell me about their characteristics. I need to understand this better, because the way the behavior of these bhaktas are described is quite amazing. So what is that description that amazed Maharaj Nimi, such that he needed to inquire further, such that these 11 verses, the first of which is the one we're talking about now, to explain the characteristics of these bhaktas was explained. Those two, you could say, amazing statements are as follows. Quote, one whose right is so, in whom anurag, that is prem, has manifest, by chanting the names of Sri Bhagavan dear to oneself, and who is thus of melted heart, loudly laughs, cries, shouts, sings, and dances as though mad, oblivious to society. One in this way of one-pointed mind may offer obeisance to space, the air, fire, water, earth, the luminaries, living beings, the directions, trees and so forth, the rivers and oceans, and whatever else is existent. So we've got this spiritual path for you. It's called bhakti. If you follow it, what do you achieve? You achieve the state of dancing as though mad, becoming completely oblivious to society, and bowing down and worshiping the sky. This might sound a bit peculiar. You might not want to try to entice people to take up this path using a description like that. But nevertheless, this is what these sages, these Navayugindras who walked in on the sky path, so to speak, or who descended to the grounds of this yajna out of the sky as these realized yoga masters, this is what they have to say about this path of bhakti that they're teaching is like. So the first of these verses is especially well known. We hear elsewhere here in the Charitamrita that Isharapuripad recited this verse to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu early on when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had received Diksha and suddenly become overwhelmed with Krishna Prem and come back to his guru and said, Kiba mantra dilo goshai, kiba tar bhal, japite japite hoilo morman pago. This, Gurudev, what kind of mantra did you give me? I started chanting it and it's making my mind go crazy. When he speaks like this to Isharapuri, then Isharapuri tells him this shloka and says, one in whom prema manifests by chanting the name, their heart melts, they laugh, they cry, they shout, they sing, they dance, they become oblivious to everything. So he said, this is not, madness in the problematic sense. This is the madness of prema. I also want to achieve what you have, my dear. This is discussed in the Adi Lila. So, apart from how this might sound almost silly to some, this is actually a most profound, deep, solemn state of being, if you will, in terms of how it is that the psyche becomes attuned such that this type of behavior comes about. So what is that state of mind, or how is it that this person entered this state of being? This is what's very important to understand. So Jiva Gosvami, he gives the following explanation, which is quite insightful. He says the following: then, one who can see by means of a profusion of anurag, the space, wind, living beings, and so forth, which one sees, to in entirety be the body of Hari, that is, to be a form of beautiful Sham, wearing yellow cloth, and so forth, because of a manifestation of Sri Bhagavan everywhere, that is, all throughout the field of one's vision, just as the greedy see the world to be full of wealth, and the lustful see the world to be full of desirable women. And one thus offers obeisance to them, meaning, out of bhakti, one becomes of bowed figure before them all. The cause of this is indicated by the word one of one-pointed mind, which means one before whom any other manifestation is absent, as per the statement in the Gita, those who have full self-control are awake in that which is night for all beings, and all beings are awake in that which is night for the sage who sees. So, as seeing in night and day are opposites, like, owls or skunks or certain entities can see and flourish in the dark, but can't see at all in the daytime. And other human, living beings can only see in the sunlight and can't see at all in the dark. Similarly, the perception of uttam or advanced Bhagavatas and a common person are as different as light and dark, or they're complete opposites in perception. So Jiva Gosvami construes this as on a spectrum between Bahirmukata and Unmukata, or what he calls Sammukya. To be facing away from Bhagavan and to be facing towards or intent upon Bhagavan. This is essentially the difference between samsara and moksha, or between purity and impurity, light, dark, etc. So those persons who are so unmuk or so sammuk, so focused, so to speak, facing towards Bhagavan, to the extent that they actually can't see anything other than him, those persons are said to have achieved siddhi, or that itself could be described as accomplishment or success on the path of bhakti. So he was referring to a famous statement by saying, the greedy see the world to be full of wealth, the lustful see the world to be full of women, and dhiro narayanam jagat, I forget the rest of it, but it says, and the wise see the world to be full of Narayan. This is the final line in the verse, which he doesn't bother to quote because that's already what's being said here. So the idea is that under the influence of prem within this psyche, the person becomes so fixated, so aware of Bhagavan that they can't lose awareness of Bhagavan. This is something that came up some time back in some of the Sandarbha classes in reference to the Vyabhichari Bhava in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of sleep, where Chakravarti Pad explains that actually, although in deep sleep, one doesn't have any cognitive functions taking place, and thus, conventionally speaking, one would have no awareness of Bhagavan if one went into deep sleep. He explains that Uttam Bhagavatas, in whose psyche Bhav Bhakti has manifest, actually retain a static vritti of perception of Bhagavan's form, even in deep sleep. So in one sense, they don't ever actually sleep. Like, they actually just become aware of Bhagavan in a static state. So the, quote, inactivity that we associate with sleep is actually a perception of Bhagavan being inactive such that they can relax. You could take it almost like this. And that therefore to be awake is then to see the animate form of Bhagavan and to ever be engaged in reciprocating and serving him accordingly. So there's this, in other words, a constant variety of spurti, or cognitive awareness of Bhagavan, that's uninterrupted in these persons whose psyche is under the influence of the Chit Shakti. So under the influence of that higher Shakti, then they perceive everything in the animation as being pervaded by or having the presence of Bhagavan within it. And even for sadhakas, as is discussed also in the Bhakti Sandarbha on the basis of verses in the Bhagavatam, to see and to meditate upon the presence of Bhagavan within everyone, to never conceive that one is outside of Bhagavan's presence, is actually highly conducive to development on the path of bhakti. In other words, when we feel ourselves to be in the presence of Bhagavan, then we have the presence of mind to be respectful, to be attentive to his pleasure, etc. When we perceive that we're somehow away from him or apart from him, then with that can come, all other senses of independence and an absence of attentiveness to service and his satisfaction. So even for sadhakas, this is something prescribed, as something to be cultivated. But in the case of Uttam Bhaktas, this is something that becomes lodged, if you will, in the psyche, such that it's automatic. They can't lose awareness of Bhagavan. Wherever they are, whoever they're interacting with, they're actually interacting with the presence of Bhagavan within or pervading that person, such that when they're quote-unquote described here as bowing down to trees and rivers and the wind and so forth, the sense is not that they're actually worshiping grass and trees, but that they're recognizing and aware of the presence of Bhagavan pervading all of those things, and thus constantly engaged in acts of bhakti to him. And then, under the influence of the manner in which they perceive him, inspired to laugh or cry or dance or sing or what have you. Chakravarti Pad's commentary on that verse is very rich. We went into some of this in some other this other course I'm doing on the Padyavali, so I won't elaborate further on that, but there's other discussion there for anyone interested. Anyway, the point here in this context is in Jiva Goswami's interpretation, he's speaking about this idea of seeing the presence of Bhagavan, the Ishta Devata that one has in one's heart or in one's mind, also present in everyone else. This is, you could say, the background or how it is that this is possible for a bhakta to see that way. And a further illustration is given here in reference to the Yugal Gita. Sri Jivapad also refers to a statement of the Braja Gopis in the Yugal Gita as an illustration of the vision described in the aforesaid interpretation of the verse under discussion. Quote, when Krishna calls the cows roaming on the hillside from within the forest with his flute, the forest creepers and trees abounding with fruits and flowers, their branches bowed under the weight thereof, and their bodies delighted or haripalating with prem, shower streams of nectar, as though manifesting Vishnu in their hearts. So the Braja Gopis are Uttam Bhagavatas, they're the Uttam of the Uttam of the Uttam. So they are perceiving the trees and the other foliage here in Vrindavan as if to be full of the presence of Bhagavan in their heart, and then interpreting the swaying of their branches or the flowering and the fruiting of their shoots as to be like shedding tears and exhibiting various types of sattvika bhavas or anubhavas in response to the presence of Bhagavan within the heart. So they're seeing Bhagavan within the heart of everyone because of the intensity of their own awareness and absorption and longing for Bhagavan themselves. So, okay, that's interpretation number 2. Now we go to a third interpretation, which is a second interpretation we're taking from Jiva Goswami's work. Sri Jivapad offers another alternate interpretation of the first half of the verse under discussion as follows, which is based on construing the word bhavam to mean prema rather than presence or manifestation, as it was done in the previous interpretations. So, quote, one who can see one's own prema, or bhavam, for Bhagavan, in all entities, both the conscious and the unconscious, is an advanced Bhagavata. So in the previous interpretation, one is seeing one's Ishta Devata in everyone else. And now he's saying that you can take the Atmana as modifying bhavam rather than Bhagavan, which would actually be a more grammatically conventional way of reading it. And by doing that, you get the idea that one who has this prema sees the presence of their own prema in everyone else. So because they have this prema, they think everyone else has prema, just the way people tend to think that everyone else thinks the same way they do about things. Like I did when I thought, I'll come here and give the class, but didn't remember to tell anyone else. Just like that, actual bhaktas, they have such prema that they think everybody has prema. Everyone loves Bhagavan just like us. So, therefore, he interprets it like that. So Chakravarti Pad complements this interpretation by taking the second line in a similar way. So he says, one who can see all entities to be possessed of prema for the specific form of Bhagavan that manifests within the self, one's own mind, is an advanced Bhagavata. So if you put the two together, then you can get a full alternate. In other words, rather than saying one who sees one's Ishtadevata and others in the Ishtadevata, you get the idea that one who sees their own prema for their Ishtadevata in everyone else, and who sees everyone else to have prema for their Ishtadevata. This is how it can also be read. So in this regard, Sri Jiva Pad explains that an advanced Bhagavata offers obeisances to space, the air, fire, water, earth, and so on, as was described in 11.241, out of bhakti manifest from the perception of space, the air, fire, water, earth, and so forth, all being dwelling places of Bhagavan, by virtue of their all being perceived to be bhaktas of Bhagavan. Since an advanced bhakta is here said to see the prema that they personally have for Bhagavan to be present in all other entities as well. So this is a second way that interpretation of bowing down to the sky and the rivers and so forth isn't taken. It's one thing to say they see Bhagavan in everything, so they're honoring the presence of Bhagavan within all those things. But now he's saying that they're actually perceiving the grass to be a prem bhakta. They're actually perceiving the wind to have prema for Krishna. They're actually perceiving the sky to be a bhakta with prema for Krishna. And then they're thinking, I'm in the presence of all these prem bhaktas. And then they're bowing down to the sky and the water and the earth, thinking that these are all prem bhaktas in my midst who are most worthy of being honored. This is how it can be taken in the second sense. And we see an example of this in the Yugal Gita. So the commentators quote the following verse in the Yugal Gita, which is rendered as follows. Then, hearing that flute song of Mukunda, the rivers, their currents obstructed by an upwelling of love, beheld in the form of whirlpools as they offer offerings of lotuses, clasped with the arms of their waves the 2 feet of Mukunda, which had been stopped by their embrace. So if Krishna is standing somewhere in the water of the Yamuna, then as the water is passing over him, as some whirlpool is forming around him, as the water is being somewhat obstructed by his legs in the water, then the gopis are perceiving this river to be, or the Jamuna more specifically, to be a prem bhakta, and to think that this whirlpool of water that's arising is actually a manifestation of the river's prema, and that the lotuses growing in the river are like this prem bhakta offering lotuses to Krishna's legs or to Krishna's feet, that the waves of this water are like the arms with which the river is embracing Krishna's feet. So they're perceiving the presence of their own prema for Krishna in the water or in the river. So this is how, and illustrating this second line of interpretation. Sri Chakravarti Pad further states that the aforecited explanatory verse of Sri Sanatana Pad can also be understood to convey the alternate meaning thus discussed, since the word bhavam can be construed to mean either presence or prema, and the word atmana, one's own, can be taken to apply either to the word bhavam specifically, or to the mention of Bhagavan in compound with the word bhavam. Sri Sanatana Pad also offers another interpretation. So this is, as I said, this is a rich verse. Jiva Gosvami, Chakravarti Pad, Sanatana Pad, they've all given multiple interpretations of it. So I hope everyone likes to appreciate all these details. So we'll look further at the alternate interpretation of Sanatana Gosvami that he gives in Hari Bhakti Vilas, based on construal of the word bhavam to mean prema rather than presence, and atmani to mean self rather than one's own or in one's mind, as it was construed in the previous interpretations. So, quote, one who can see the prema of one's own Bhagavan, one's Ishta Devata Sri Krishna for all entities, and because of that, the bhava, that is prema of all entities for Bhagavan, the self, is an advanced Bhagavata. So in the previous interpretation, we had the idea that we're seeing all the entities to have prema for Krishna. So in this interpretation, he's saying we're seeing Krishna to have prema for all living entities. This is the other way it can be read. So, in other words, just as everyone loves Krishna, the Bhakta also sees that Krishna has prema for everyone. Krishna has prema for everything around one. That everything, the water, the clouds, the birds, the trees, are all objects of Krishna's prema as well. And he elaborates on this as follows. In regard to this interpretation, Sri Sanatana Pad offers 3 explanations as to how an advanced Bhagavata can see that all entities have bhava, that is prema for Sri Bhagavan, all of which are derived from different imports of Sri Bhagavan's being described in the verse as, quote, Atmani, or the self. So number 1, Bhagavan, like the self, is by nature an object of prema for the world, that is, all living beings. That is, just as the self is an object of unconditional prema for every embodied being, because it is a source of satisfaction, sukha or ananda, and satisfaction is the object of unconditional prema for every embodied being, so Bhagavan, who is the self of the self, is an object of unconditional prema for all living beings, since he is the ultimate source of the fundamental object of unconditional prema, namely satisfaction, sukha. So I've fortified Sanatana Gosvami's commentary a little bit on this point with a couple of very insightful points of Jiva Gosvami from the Sandarbha, just to flush out what he's saying. And this is something that Jiva Gosvami returns to repeatedly throughout the Sandarbhas, as well as in numerous places in his commentaries on the Bhagavat, the Krama Sandarbha, the Vaishnav Toshani. And especially in the Tattva Sandarbha, in I think it's Anucheta 46 or 45, where he states 4 fundamental reasons for Bhagavan being an object of prema, and prema being the purushartha, or the prayojana, then one of them is that he describes Bhagavan as the parama swarup, and referring to that as the nirupadi premaspada, or the parama nirupadi premaspada. So this is a phrase that you find maybe 10 times in Jiva Goswami's writing throughout the Sandarbhas and elsewhere. This phrase, nirupadi premaspada, which means, and also in the whole debates about the jiva and bhakti and all this, there's been some misinterpretation of this phrase, because the word aspada can mean both an object and a container, to put it bluntly. So you can, and according to context, the word is used in both ways. But Jiva Gosvami, in this context, as well as most other contexts, in practically every context in which he uses the word, he uses it to mean object rather than a vessel or a container or a shelter. So when he says that the Atma, or the self, is a nirupadi premaspada, then some people, for those who are acquainted with this whole debate, might immediately say, hey, look, he's saying that the jiva is an aspada, a shelter of nirupadi prema, of unconditional prema. Look, right here, Jiva Gosvami is saying that the jiva, it has unconditional prema inside it. Look, 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 it's right here in the Paramatma Sandarbha. So, not so fast. Rather, Jiva Goswami's intention is not that the word aspata means vessel, container, shelter in this context. Rather, it means object. So what he's saying is that the self is an object of prema. Why? Because elsewhere, as he says, and as I ended with this quote, because, as he says, quote, satisfaction is the object of unconditional prema for every living entity. So he says, Sukham cha nirupadi prityaspada. If he meant, when he uses this exact same phrase, nirupadi prityaspada or nirupadi premaspada, he could never say that if the word aspada meant shelter about an abstract thing like happiness. That would make no sense. So it's obvious that when he says the word aspada, he means object. In other words, what does everyone want? What does everyone like? What is everyone in life constantly pursuing? Happiness. Happiness is the object of everyone's affinity, of everyone's desire, of everyone's love, of everyone's attraction. Happiness is what everyone wants. That's all he's saying. It's like a classical philosophical Sanskrit way of talking, informed by Nyaya Shastra, which is basically just saying happiness is what everyone wants. Happiness is what everyone holds dear. So when he says that, uses the exact same phrase, nirupadi prityaspada or nirupadi premaspada, to describe the Atma, what he means is that there is some, and elsewhere Sanatana Gosvami certainly argues that it's meager, and that's another topic, but that there is some sukh or some ananda in the self, and that the self is an object of priti for the conditioned mind, because from the self there can be experienced sukh. And sukh is the thing that everyone is actually after. So then the argument is developed by saying, when Bhagavan is the Parama Swarup, or the Paramatma, or the Atma of the Atma, then he's the source of the sukh that's in the self. He's the source and the infinite source of the sukh that's in every other individual self. So how much would he be an object of unconditional affinity? Or how much would one be inclined to him? If the thing that everyone's inclined to is sukh, and he's the source of all sukh, then he would be the ultimate object of prema, or the ultimate object of unconditional attraction, interest, desire, the ultimate source of all possible fulfillment. So that's the point that Jiva Gosvami is making here, and what Sanatana Gosvami is also stating in this case. So the topic here is, how can we see that all entities have prema for Bhagavan, or why would all entities do that? Then he's giving a reason. And he's saying that they can be perceived this way, meaning Bhagavan, like the self, is by nature an object of prema for the world. That is, just as the self is an object of unconditional prema for every embodied being, because it is a source of satisfaction, sukh, ananda, and satisfaction is the object of unconditional prema for every embodied being, so Bhagavan, who is the self of the self, is an object of unconditional prema for all living beings, since he is the ultimate source of the fundamental object of unconditional prema, namely sukh, or satisfaction. So this doesn't mean that every entity innately possesses prema. This is talking about the way the psyche of embodied beings functions, that no cognition of any kind can happen without a psyche. An atma without a psyche has no actual cognitive awareness. When it's embodied, when it's given a subtle body, then there can be the experience of, vrittis in the chitta, then there can be a chitta, then the gyatrita, the bhoktrita, these potentials, potent capabilities that the jiva can give rise to become actualized in the chitta. Then in the context of cognition, under the influence of anadiya vidya, the absence of sukh is felt because the sukh inherent in the self experience of that is suppressed by maya. Then there's the drive for sukh in the psyche, and then there's the understanding that from the self, or from the self of the self, there would naturally be, or one would feel unconditional prema for that self, or that supreme self, if and when one were able to have the vasana or the bhav necessary to experience that. And that's the whole path of bhakti, is basically to make possible the tuning of the psyche that will enable that experience of tapping into or experiencing this ultimate satisfaction that's found in the self of all selves, the source of the sukh that's found in the sukh of all, namely Bhagavan. So in that way, or on this premise, it can be understood that it's most natural to perceive, or that one could then in that way see, under the influence of the prema within oneself, that everyone else has this type of mentality, which is, philosophically someone might be able to imagine it, but what we're talking about here, and as Chakravartipad makes more explicit later, is that this whole discussion about how an Uttam Bhakta sees is not a philosophical exercise. It's not that he learned all these tattvas and now he's like seeing the world through an eye of knowledge. It's not merely that. It's actually the drive of the Chit Shakti pushing his psyche to see that way. It's non-voluntary. It's something beyond a mere theoretical understanding. But anyway, that'll be clarified further later. So I better stop because we're out of time. So we'll have to look at the rest of these reasons for Sanatana Gosvami's interpretation and the rest of the discussion of this verse next time. But in short, the conclusion on this exact topic is that one can see it under the influence of the prema within one's own psyche, it to be natural, if you will, that all other entities have prema for him because he's the self of all living beings, and all living beings naturally have an affinity for sukh, or naturally an affinity for bliss, and he is that bliss and the source of that bliss for all. So, in summary, an Uttam Bhakta, under the influence of their prem, sees either the presence of Bhagavan in everyone, or prema for Bhagavan in everyone, or Bhagavan's prema for everyone in everyone, and vice versa in all three cases. So I'll stop there, and if anyone would like to comment or question or correct anything, please feel free to do so.
Maharaj?
Yes.
So I think you cleared up my second question. I was confused about the difference between the first interpretations, but you just mentioned it in your summary. The third, in the third interpretation, when the gopis see that all the living entities, whatever, seem to have praying, do they actually, or that's just their vision?
You're saying, do all living entities actually have it?
Well, the gopis are seeing their own bhav.
Yeah.
In the river, and the trees.
Yeah.
That's just their vision. That's not necessarily true, is it?
Well, we could go either way, I think. In one sense, they're seeing their own bhav in the other, and that's why the acaryas are citing this verse in this case. So you could attribute it to their vision. But in this context, who are they also seeing? They're also seeing the other parikaras of Bhagavan in Brajadam, who are all chinmoy and also constituted of prem in their own right. In other words, we do understand that in Goloka, in the realm of this lila, the cows, the birds, the trees themselves are all prem bhaktas. So in that sense, the Yamuna can also be understood to have prem in their own right as well. So depending on what side you want to emphasize, I think you could take it either way. But in the context of this interpretation, the emphasis is on them projecting their bhav into the other.
Good. I heard you mention that you're giving class on Pajavali. Is that true?
It is.
Is it open to other people?
Yeah.
Is it in English?
It's is. Yeah, it is.
Okay. Who would I contact? I know that you're a busy man. Vilas or someone?
I'll just send you a link. Just stay on here afterwards. I can quick drop you a link. No problem.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Sure. All right, well then, that looks like it's it for today. So I'll conclude here. My pranams to all the Vaishnavas, Vaishnavibhyo, Namo Namo. And if we're so blessed, we'll continue. We'll hear more about these Uttam Bhaktas. And, why are we hearing about this? It's not just for the sake of hearing, but that a little nourishment can come to our own longing for such an extraordinary state of consciousness as this type of prem, to nourish that longing, that regard, that admiration for the beauty of Krishna prem. This is our aim in discussion in a broad sense as sadhakas. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.